ご賞味あれ。丈一郎特製こってりラーメンだ。
ラーメン？
朝からですか？
I was really hoping my hair would be long enough for this.
First thing we're gonna do is start off with making our broth. Now, this is a vegan broth, so this can actually be relatively easy to make. We're gonna start off with 4 dried shiitake mushrooms and about 3 pieces of large konbu. I like to let this soak for about 2 to 3 hours before we get started, and once you have it soaked, we're gonna place this over the stove over about a medium heat. The reason why you want this over a medium heat is because you don't actually want to boil out this konbu. Once you see some bubbles start to form, this is gonna take about 15 to 20 minutes depending on how much liquid. You remove the konbu and then actually bring that liquid to a simmer with the mushrooms for an additional 30 minutes. Now, to thicken the broth, we're going to actually be using Ebi Taro, which they mentioned specifically. This is kind of interesting because Ebi Taro is actually full of starch and it allows us to thicken this soup. We also do need some ginger and some garlic for this, and we're only going to be using a few cloves of garlic and a few small nubs of ginger. You want to make sure that your ginger and your garlic is finely minced, just because we are going to incorporate this in the soup, and if the pieces are too big, you're going to end up with weird bits of large ginger and garlic. I mean, unless that's your thing, and then you do you. Now remove all those mushrooms from your stock, and you can save these mushrooms if you would like for something later to throw into a stir fry or something like that, and they taste really, really nice. We also need to sear off some of the miso because they had mentioned that it was kind of a charred miso flavor, which will give it this really nice nuttiness, but over just kind of a medium heat, you want to start charring off some white miso, and be careful because it will start to burn. Take your charred miso and place that into your dashi along with 1 tablespoon of garlic and 1 tablespoon worth of ginger, reserving some of the fresh stuff for later. Give this a good spooning so that way it is totally spooned, and then after that we're going to add in about 1 cup worth of soy milk. Make sure you're using the unsweetened stuff, you don't want sweetened soy milk for this. And now we just have to let this come up to a simmer while we make hand puppets again on camera. I don't know why I do this every single video, I swear it's at every video. While this is coming up to a simmer, we're going to start to grate all of that Ebi Taro directly into our stock. Be careful when you're doing this because that Ebi Taro is super slippery. And I would recommend using some kind of a guard if you have one to start shredding this stuff. Make sure you get all of the good out of the inside of that grater because you do want to make sure that you get the full amount of that taro into your stock. As this starts to come up to a simmer, you want to make sure that you're constantly whisking it so none of that taro sits at the bottom. If it does have a chance of burning, and you really don't want that flavor in this. We're going to let this simmer for about 15 to 20 minutes until it's nice and thick. And now to make our noodles. Yes, we are making our own yuzu noodles. For this, we're going to start with 300 grams of all-purpose flour and 200 grams of bread flour, followed by 5 grams worth of salt. Now we're going to take 250 grams worth of water and add 5 grams worth of potassium carbonate. This is going to give it that really, really nice stringy texture and that really nice chewiness you would find in ramen noodles. I like to add this potassium straight to the water so that way it can dilute just a little bit better. Now we also need to add some yuzu extract. For this, we are using about 50 grams worth of yuzu extract. Alternatively, you can use something like citric acid, but I don't recommend using that as much. First, we're going to add in our water and kind of give this just a little bit of a mix with a wooden spoon. Don't use your hands right away because that potassium carbonate can kind of mess with your fingers. Once you've slowly stirred in the water, add in all of your yuzu juice and continue to mix this with your wooden spoon until you get this kind of clumpy, shaggy looking mess of a dough ball. This is going to take about 5 to 6 minutes before you start to see all of that liquid absorb. Once you can't really stir this with a spoon anymore, like you can see here, this is when we're actually going to start using our hands to start forming a cohesive dough. I end up folding this first part of the dough for about 10 to 15 minutes until it is no longer tacky. There must have been something interesting going on with that yuzu juice because it was tacky for quite a while, so I ended up touching it up with just a little more AP flour until I can get a nice shininess to the dough. After your dough is nice and cohesive, dust it with just a touch of flour, and then we're going to throw a lid on this to let rest for about an hour before we do another process. Don't let this sit anywhere too warm because it's going to affect the dough in a negative way. I just kept this at room temperature. Now after that hour, we're going to start folding this guy. On a floured surface, we're going to go ahead and roll out this this dough so we can actually fold this into a couple of parts. With your rolling pin, roll this out and move the bowl, dude. You need room for this stuff. After giving this a nice whiff and smelling all of the yuzu, we're gonna fold this over. You wanna make sure the dough is only about 1/4 inch in thickness before you start folding this over. Once it's folded over, give it a little sprinkle with some flour, and we're gonna roll this out one more time to about 1/4 inch thickness. This is going to allow us to fold it over for a second time before we actually allow this to rest. During this entire process, the dough is gonna get harder and harder to work with, and you don't wanna force it if that's the case. But after we roll everything out and fold it over, we have a nice little plump boy of dough, and we're gonna let this rest for another hour before we finally finish making our noodles. So now after that little hour of relaxation, it's time to pound the dough. Yes, I wasn't going there. Go ahead and roll your dough out into manageable pieces, and for me, manageable was about 6 equal portions, as you'll see in just a minute. You want to make sure that you're able to roll this out to at least 1/4 inch, so that way you can get it through your pasta machine. And I've never used an automatic pasta machine before, and I was really excited to use it, and I quickly learned that I failed very easily. After cutting the dough down just a little bit more, I was able to get this through, and I noticed with this dough in particular, since it is ramen dough, I had to have the speed up just a little bit higher, as you can see from this mangly, gangly mess of a noodle that we had made. You do want to keep these super dry because there is a high moisture content in these, and that had a lot to do with why it didn't go through my pasta machine very well. But after a little bit of trial and error, I feel like we were able to nail this one. You can place these on a sheet tray with a little bit of flour to cool down for just a bit, but I was able to make this come out really, really nice, and I was super happy with the end result. I kept the pasta machine maker on high speed so that way it would cut the noodles very quickly, and I was able to get all of these beautiful nests of yuzu ramen noodles. I went ahead and left these in the fridge just so that way we can use them later. So now for that little bit of chili oil they mentioned earlier. They didn't really give any specifics, but I'm going to be using a little bit of Szechuan peppercorn for this to start because I love the flavor, and you know, you do you. We're grinding about 2 tablespoons worth of the Szechuan peppercorns before we actually heat up some oil separately. Now we're not toasting the Szechuan peppercorns because what we're going to be doing with the oil is actually steeping it in the warm oil instead. Remember some of that fresh garlic and ginger? Yeah, we're going to be adding in 1 tablespoon worth of each to this, followed by about a ½ teaspoon worth of cayenne pepper. Once your oil is ready to go, drop in 1 little piece of garlic or ginger, and if it starts frying up, it's just a little bit too warm. Let it cool down until a nicer temperature, and then dump all of that oil in there, give it a nice stir, and realize that it's not as red as you would like, so we're gonna add in about 1 tablespoon worth of paprika. Once you have your paprika in there, we're gonna let this just hang out and steep and get delicious. Now we gotta work on a little bit of our vegetable, and for that we're gonna be using burdock and a little bit of lotus root. We're only gonna need about half of each of these, not too much, and that's honestly totally up to you, but you do wanna make sure that they're nice and peeled before we really begin the rest of the process. Once they're peeled, we gotta get these super thin, and if you're using a knife, just make sure it's super sharp. You want these at about 1/8 inch thick. Any thicker than that, and they're actually not gonna deep fry properly. Now for the burdock, I had a harder time with this, and I tried using my peeler by pressing into it pretty hard, and I was able to get some strips out of it. I did also try to use my box grater because it has this little attachment on the side, but that just ended up being too thick. Alternatively, if you have a mandolin, which I really do need to purchase, you can use that instead. Now drop these in some oil to start frying them up, and realize that your oil is far too hot to do this, and yeah, we don't want those. Let your oil cool down just a little bit to about 350 degrees, and fry these for only about 10 to 15 seconds until they're nice and G-bad. As soon as you pull them out of the fryer, season them. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to season them later. Now we're going to do the same thing with the lotus root. The lotus root does fry up for a little bit longer, but no more than about 30 to 45 seconds, just until they're G-bad as well. Now remember, you do want to season these as well right out of the fryer, otherwise it's not going to make sense later. And there we have our beautiful golden deliciousness. Now we also have to get some roasted vegetables ready, and for this we're going to be using some fresh carrot, just nicely peeled, nothing too crazy, and slice these into about 1/4 inch thickness. The quantity is totally up to you, but I'm only using about ½ a carrot. We're also going to be using a little bit of fresh turnip. I probably should have peeled this ahead of time with my peeler instead of my knife, but I digress. Now we are going to slice these into wedges, and the wedges don't need to be too thick, about 1/2 inch thickness at the actual fatter part of your wedge. We're going to season our carrots with salt, oil, and pepper. Give this a good toss and make sure that you just get carrots everywhere. Just get them all over the place, because otherwise without floor seasoning, it's not going to make sense. Now line up your seasoned carrots onto a nice little grilling dish. I'm just using a little baking dish because I'm going to throw these in my toaster oven. Do the same thing with your turnips and get these ready to roast off. We're going to roast these off at 350 for about 15 minutes until they're nice and tender. And now for the tempeh. This is our protein for the dish, and this is a fermented soybean that has a ton of nutrition behind it. We're gonna start off by slicing this into smaller squares to work with because it's going to sit really nicely on the ramen. I cut these to about 1/4 of an inch of thickness, so that way when we go ahead and slice it, we're gonna be able to soak this in our sauce of choice. Get everything sliced up and place this onto a plate and realize that the plate just isn't big enough for what we need, and dump this into a bowl or something else. We're gonna add in a little bit of homemade teriyaki sauce, which is soy sauce, sesame oil, sake, mirin, and rice vinegar. Recipe down below for that. Once you get that soaked up, we're gonna let this sit for about 10 to 15 minutes before we start frying it. Use a saute pan over a medium heat, nothing too hot, because if you have it too hot, this tempeh can burn very easily. The reason for that is the sugars in that special teriyaki sauce we made. After about 4 or 5 minutes of cooking each side, we're gonna go ahead and flip each one, and you can see that there is a little bit too much color, but it's not gonna impact the taste too hard. Dump the rest of your sauce right on top with an equal amount of water. The reason why you wanna do this is so that way you can heat up the tempeh all the way through, and it's actually going to soak up a lot of that sauce. You can see how the color has changed so much from adding in that sauce. Turn off the heat and remove all of your tempeh and place them into whatever dish you are using, and then drop all of that extra sauce right on top. This is ready to go for our plate up. Now it's time for our plate up, and for this, we're gonna need a nice sized bowl. Just make sure that the bowl is clean, you know? It'll be fine, don't worry about it. Take one portion of your ramen noodles and drop this into crazy boiling water. It should be boiling the whole time. Unfortunately, my stove doesn't get that hot, but just make sure it's boiling. We're gonna be cooking this for about 90 seconds, but checking it at about 60 just to make sure it's done. After about 90 seconds, remove your fresh cooked yuzu ramen from that water in the most roundabout way possible and move this back over to your cutting board. Realize that your bowl is just a little bit too big and grab a smaller bowl. Dump your noodles in that and then place 2 pieces of your tempeh on top, followed by 2 pieces of your turnips and 2 pieces of your roasted carrots. Arrange this however you want, but I think having the tempeh up front looks really nice. Now we're gonna add in some of our secret vegan soy broth right on top to kind of fill everything up. The reason why I assembled it like that is because I wanted some of that flavor on top of everything. Now garnish it with your fried lotus root and your fried burdock. Hit this with just a touch of that beautiful red chili oil, or a lot depending on how much you really want, but I just did a touch because it looks really pretty. And there you have it, Saiba'S breakfast vegan ramen from Food Wars. It's really good, guys. There it is, guys. Saiba'S breakfast special rich ramen. What was it called? Something weird. Now the kicker is to really try to make those yuzu noodles, simply because that's what they had mentioned. I wouldn't recommend really cooking like regular ramen noodles in yuzu juice with water, because the acidity is going to be weird in that actual water as you're boiling them. Instead, you want that yuzu flavor to come directly from the noodle itself and not really from water. So the first thing I really want to do is try this broth. It looks really rich. Like, what's really neat about using the taro to thicken it is that it looks really, really rich, and it almost has that same tonkatsu-like consistency from the taro and the soy milk. And then the chili oil on there. Wow, I did not expect. It's so weird because you do taste the soy milk, but it doesn't leave like a film on your tongue. Ooh, that's good. That's really nice. Let's see how it is with the noodles. My first time making ramen noodles, especially with yuzu juice. There it is. You get a little bit of the yuzu. I honestly think, as I was making this, I probably would have been better off trying to make my own yuzu powder. But they still have a bite to them. They're still tender. These are good. I'm really happy with these. And then for the teriyaki tempeh, it has a nice kind of caramelized flavor to it from that soy sauce and that teriyaki sauce. Then you have our roasted turnips. Perfect. And our roasted carrots. Nice and al dente. And there's our lotus root. Let's see if we can still get a crunch. Oh yeah, that little bit of textural difference is really, really nice with everything. Let me know what your favorite style of ramen is. Mine is still shoyu style ramen, and I will probably never, ever, ever change that. Hit up my Patreon to really support the channel and get yourself a bunch of extra goodies. My name's Chef PK. Get subscribed, and remember, keep playing with your food. Eat this. Probably lose some more clothing.